All right, let's just go ahead and get started. For those of you that are here already, thank you so much for joining us for the second AAPG Women's Network Technical Webinar of 2022. In order to see past technical webinars, as well as other AAPG Women's Network events, which would include a variety of events such as discussions on diversity and inclusion, or even an event on the geology of beer, please check out our YouTube channel. And that link will be dropped in the chat right now. And this event will be uploaded to the YouTube channel in the near future. Furthermore, please consider registering for the AAPG Women's Network, which includes signing up in order to receive our communications for future events. And that link will also be dropped in the chat. All right, so today's event is a two-part event. We're going to start with a technical research presentation by Nicole Gonzalez, who I will introduce in a minute. And after that, we will have some questions and answers from the audience. And then we will transition into a panel on the importance of fieldwork for geoscience education. For that panel discussion, Nicole will be joined by Dr. David Mohrig, her advisor, as well as Dr. Ron D. Martinson. And I will introduce those panelists further once we get to the panel. So my name is Rebecca Caldwell. I am the AAPG Women's Network Technical Program Director. I'm also a research geoscientist at Chevron. Today I am subbing in for Tara George, who was advertised as being our moderator today. Unfortunately, she can't make it due to a last-minute work commitment, but this is good reason, as she reminded us that she is partly able to enjoy her current career because of the things she learned when she was a master's student by Dr. David Mohrig, who is one of our panelists today. And so she was happy to report that she was able to learn a lot, including a lot of fieldwork experience. And that is why she has this great career that has unfortunately meant she cannot join us today. I am joined today by Sharvni, who you can go ahead and wave quickly, Sharvni. She is an AAPG Women's Network webinar committee member, and she will be helping me by dropping things in the chat and monitoring the participants as they enter. All right, so during the event today, whenever you have questions that you want to ask Nicole during her research presentation or the panelists during the panel, when it comes to time for Q&A, you can please go ahead and raise your digital hand, and I will call on you and ask you to unmute yourself, turn your camera on, and go ahead and ask your questions directly to the speakers. We do highly encourage this level of engagement. However, if you'd prefer, please feel free to drop questions in the chat and I will read them to the speakers. All right, now let me quickly introduce Nicole. And as I said, I will introduce the other panelists when we get to the panel. So Nicole Gonzalez is receiving her master's this Friday at the Jackson School of Geosciences at UT Austin. So congratulations, Nicole. At the Jackson School, she worked with her advisor, Dr. David Mohrig, on research that she'll be presenting today. She is highly involved in the geosciences in many other ways, including being a Geoforce Texas alumni, a UT Geoscience ambassador, and she is highly involved with the AAPG Women's Network by being on the webinar planning committee and also one of our social media chairs. I am also just adding here that Nicole has been a mentee of mine through the GSA, through a GSA program for many, many years now, and it's been really exciting to see her finish undergrad, apply to grad schools, and complete her research, and get an internship with Hillcorp, which she is taking this summer. And so I'm really excited to see everything you've been working on, Nicole. And so with that, I'm gonna pass it off to Nicole. Everyone, please make sure you are muted and your cameras are off for this portion. And one last reminder that this is being recorded and will be shared to YouTube. All right, go ahead and share your screen, Nicole.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. I'm gonna share the screen here. I'm gonna, whoops, sorry. Oops. No, that's not what I need you to see. Oops, oops, I'm giving away. Can you see my screen?
Yes, that's good.
Okay. No, giving away some of the presentation. No, it's okay. Okay, I'm gonna minimize this. Okay, thank you so much, Rebecca, for that Really nice introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Nicole Gonzalez. Thank you for joining our webinar today. I've had the pleasure of working under Dr. David Mohrig here at UT in developing this project for my master's thesis. It's a super neat project, and I'm excited to share our findings with you today. So the title of my project is The Evidence for Multiple Styles of Sediment Gravity Flows, Constructing a Prodelta-to-Shelf Depositional Environment, Coaledo Formation, Southwest Oregon. So the motivation behind this work was to refine the interpretation of shallow marine storm beds in the lower Coaledo Formation to better understand how sediment gravity flows, specifically hyperpycnal flows, aid in constructing delta front and prodelta-to-shelf depositional environments. And this work is important because these deposits serve as potential oil and gas reservoirs. So first, to orient ourselves, this work took place near Coos Bay, Oregon, which is located here in between Eugene and Medford and is located on the southwest Oregon coast. In B here, you can see a zoom in on Coos Bay. And then we have to the west of that, Sunset Bay State Park, which is where our field site is located. So the exposures of Coaledo Formation in the sea cliffs and wave cut platforms of Sunset Bay State Park preserve world-class examples of shallow marine facies ranging from deltaic to outer shelf deposits. The Eocene rocks of the Coaledo Formation were deposited in the Tyee-Fork Basin in the late early Eocene to middle Eocene, following the deposition of the Tyee and Elkton formations. The red arrow on this figure from Santra et al. Is an approximate location of our depositional system. So the Coaledo Formation is divided into three members, a lower, upper, and middle member. However, for this study, we focused on the lower member, which is superbly exposed at Sunset Bay State Park, which is right here. So my work was entirely field-based, so it's perfect that I'm participating in this webinar about the importance of fieldwork. We measured 10 stratigraphic sections that encompass 3 parasequences. So this is a figure by Chan and Dot that shows the 4 uppermost parasequences of the lower Coaledo. Parasequence 1 was not measured due to poor exposure. We focus on parasequences 2 through 4. And while we were in the field, we used drones to image these outcrops and collected hand samples. We then separated the beds within the 3 studied parasequences into 9 depositional facies. We also studied the vertical and lateral distributions of these facies within parasequence 2 and 3. And so the overall goal of this project was really to connect our field observations and process-based interpretations to support a depositional model for the storm beds of the Coaledo that include sediment gravity flows. And so for this talk, I'll go through the facies that make up 3 types of sediment gravity flows we identified in the lower Coaledo, and then dive into our depositional model that focuses specifically on river-fed hyperpycnal flows. So river-fed hyperpycnal flows occur when the density of the incoming flow is greater than that of the standing water in the reservoir. This is a figure by Zavala 2020 showing the incoming flow plunging into the open basin and generating an undercurrent. They're linked to exceptional river floods and result in increased suspended sediment concentrations. The properties of hyperpycnites include, the properties of hyperpycnites, which I should mention are the deposits of hyperpycnal flows, include fine-grained sand with an upper grain size limit of lower medium sand, tidally-modulated laminae, and abundant organic detritus in aggregational bed forms. So keep that in the back of your mind as we go through these facies. So of the 4 parasequences exposed at Sunset Bay, I'll be focusing on the shallowing upward patterns of parasequence 2 and parasequence 3, starting with parasequence 2. So this is a stratigraphic log of parasequence 2 measured at North Sunset Bay, which you can see here in this little index map. So we're going to start at the bottom of the parasequence with our prodelta-to-shelf facies and work our way up. So the lower half of Parasequence 2 consists of thinly bedded silt to very fine sandstone with rippled and planar laminated beds. The ripple beds are dominated by combined flow and climbing ripple cross-stratification. These thin beds are separated by structureless mudstone intervals, as seen here, and burrowing is common in this facies. So the abundance of very fine sand and the thin bedded nature of this facies suggests distal deposition on the prodelta or shelf, and we interpret these beds as being the distal ends of our hyperpycnal flows. Above the prodelta-to-shelf facies, and again, here is that stratigraphic log of Parasequence 2 from North Sunset Bay. Above that, or above our prodelta-to-shelf facies, we observe load structure beds. And so this facies is really, really cool. It's built from an underlying muddier deposit and an overlying sandy deposit, commonly composed of ripples. And so what happens here is the muddy structureless basal deposit represents a low strength subaqueous debris flow, which we interpret as remobilized delta front deposits that were homogenized during transport. So as this deposit was being emplaced, a suspension-driven undercurrent was depositing suspended sediment on top of these debris flows. And over time, that suspended sediment created a more dense sandy deposit that then sunk into the fluidal debris flow underneath, producing these floating nodules of laminated and rippled strata. And so as you can see here, the ripple nodules, they range in size and shape, and they're oriented randomly in the muddy deposit. However, in some cases, the ripple nodules appear reoriented by horizontal shearing, as you can see here, which indicates downslope creep of the debris. So atop the load structure beds, we observe medium to thick beds of hummocky cross-stratification composed of fine sand containing abundant mica. There are two commonly observed basal boundaries for the HCS beds. Those with concave up lower bounding surfaces due to scouring, as you can see here in this beautiful photo. And we also have, and so these are erosive and laterally restricted and exhibit this channelized nature. And then we have those that are hummocks with sharp horizontal bases that appear non-erosive and are laterally persistent, as you can see here. So both types of these basal boundaries, these hummocks with these two types of basal boundaries, are both overlain by beds of a grading unidirectional to oscillatory ripples that are equal to or less than the HCS beds in thickness. So in this photo here, we can see combined flow ripples that appear pretty symmetrical. And in the upper left-hand corner, we have climbing ripples here, again, capping those hummock beds. And then here we have a set of grading ripples. And so the interpretation here is that these beds are generated by hyperpycnal combined flows that include a wave and a unidirectional component. And we'll dive more into that when I talk about our depositional model in a little bit. So part of that section of hummocks and ripples, we have our rippled facies, which consists of grading beds of ripples composed of oscillatory, climbing, and combined flow ripple sets. So we interpret those facies as being deposited by hyperpycnal flows with current velocity sufficiently low enough to maintain bed conditions associated with the ripple stability regime. And so the occurrence of grading ripples requires a continuous advection of suspended sediment, which to us is strong evidence for a hyperpycnal source. And again, we'll dive into this a little bit more when I talk about the depositional model. So continuing up this vertical section, we have the soft sediment deformation facies, which is tied to slumping. So this encompasses a range of deformation styles. This figure here shows a common suite of deformation that we observe in Parasequence 2. So we have recumbent folds typically at the base here, and here's a profile view of what these folds look like. And so you can see that their axes are actually oriented parallel to the slope, and the folds are typically encased in this convolute bedding, and that convolute bedding is usually overlain by the structureless layer. And so we interpret these beds as being gravity-driven releases of previously deposited delta front facies. And the presence of the folds in the subsequent convolute bedding suggests that we had higher surface gradients than a typical continental shelf. And so based on the grain size and the relic stratification, we infer that these beds were either originally Hummocky cross-stratified beds or our planar-laminated facies, which I'll discuss in a bit. And so in Parasequence 3, this facies also includes brittle faulting features and fluidization, fluidized beds that we observe in 2, but in 3, these 2 styles of deformation definitely dominate. So the last 2 facies I'm going to talk about dominate the upper portion of Parasequence 3. So we looked at the log at North Sunset Bay of Parasequence 2, and now we're going to jump to Parasequence 3, particularly here at North Treerope Cove. We've nicknamed this cove Treerope Cove. And so like in Parasequence 2, we observe hummocks capped by ripples. We have load structure beds that are present and laterally continuous. We also have, as I mentioned in the previous slide, these soft sediment deformation beds. But we also have, interestingly, in this parasequence, 3 to 5 meter thick sections of planar-laminated facies, which is then overlain by meters of what we interpret to be shoreface deposits. So I'm going to go through those 2 facies. So our planar laminated facies consists of fine sand interbedded with a lot of fine organic detritus. Our planar lamina, or the planar lamina, is sometimes interrupted by isolated ripple forms. And within the repetitive lamina, we have thicker strata that is commonly coarser grained, while thinner strata are fine grained. So this is what I'm trying to show here. The thicker lamina here is coarser and the thinner lamina here is finer. We also observe centimeter scale wood fragments that are oriented parallel to the lamina. And so these beds are interpreted as purely depositional, low density hyperpycnal flows, not linked to ocean storminess. And by low density, I just mean that they're non-erosional. We're saying this is all purely depositional. So again, kind of like the hummocks, these are sharp-based facies. We infer the repetitive thickening and coarsening followed by thinning and fining of the lamina to be a tidal signal, described as a characteristic of these mixed fluvial tidal and wave tidal deltas. So now into our shoreface facies. Now, this last facies is not linked to the identified sediment gravity flows that I've discussed. However, it does dominate that upper portion of Parasequence 3, and I want to highlight the reasons we've distinguished it from our sediment gravity flows. So the first reason is that it's coarser grained compared to our hyperpycnal flow deposits that have that like upper grain size limit of fine sand. The second reason is we have these basal lags that are pretty persistent. We see them at every location. The second reason is our hummocks and our swells that we see in our hyperpycnal flow deposits are replaced by trough crossbeds. And those trough crossbeds typically have these pebble stringers at their bases. And we also observe varying intensities of bioturbation. And so we interpret these basal lags and pebble stringers that we interpret them as being indicative of bedload transport. And then the increasing degree of bioturbation and the coarsening suggests a shallower marine environment. I also want to add that this photo here is what we call our capping shoreface deposit. Both Parasequences 2 and 3 are capped by this coarse-grained, fossiliferous, rich shoreface deposit that you see here. Okay, so as I mentioned at the beginning, the motivation behind this work was to understand how sediment gravity flows aided in constructing the shallow marine deltaic system. And it's evident through our sedimentological analysis that hyperpycnal flows were the dominant source of sediment constructing the delta front and the prodelta of our studied parasequences. So our depositional model breaks down deposits of hyperpycnal flows into 2 types. Type A hyperpycnites are wave influenced and represented by hummocky cross-stratified beds and beds of climbing ripples. which you can see here and here. We interpret the Hummocky stratification generated by these flows to have been deposited below fair weather wave face, where the suspended sediment fallout was reworked as bed load by a combined flow produced by water surface waves, and then the unidirectional flow of the undercurrent. Capping the Hummocky beds, we have those aggrading ripples. And so those aggrading ripples require continuous advection of suspended sediment to the site of deposition, which again is taken as very strong evidence for hyperpycnal, for a hyperpycnal sediment source. And then out here, distal to the river mouth, we have these thinly bedded planar and ripple-laminated facies, which represents the distal ends of those flows. And so we have fine grained sand, well, very fine grained sand, and a lot more mud out here than we do in these largely sandy deposits. And I do want to mention that another piece of evidence for our river-fed hyperpycnal source is that our deposits are very fine grained. You know, these plunging hyperpycnal currents, they owe their excess density to suspended sediment, which can range in particle size up to medium sand. However, fine and very fine sand is the most common coarse material. And so the interpreted hyperpycnal deposits of the Coaledo certainly possess this upper grain size limit, just reinforcing our interpretation. So the next type is type B, and our type B hyperpycnites are non-wave influenced and characterized by planar-laminated strata. And so by non-wave influenced, I mean that this facies was deposited during periods of stormless activity, or potentially in locations that were sheltered from waves. You know, we don't know. It just depends on the configuration of the shoreline at the time. But these beds contained a lot of leafy detritus and the largest organic fragments out of all our hyperpycnites, which suggests that they were probably more proximal in setting relative to our type A hyperpycnites. However, the most compelling evidence for a hyperpycnal source is the repetitive thickening and coarsening, followed by fining and thinning of lamina, which we interpret as a tidal signal. So just to dive into that a little bit more, here we have this super cool picture of these rhythmites. And so during flood tide, water moving inland causing a decrease in river velocity, which results in the transport of finer grained suspended sediment from the river mouth and thinner lamina, which you can see here. And then while ebb flow adds to the river discharge. So that increases velocities and promotes transport of greater volumes of coarser sediment and thicker lamina. And so since each of these like different lamina sets here represents part of a day as the tide moves in and the tide moves out, these packages can represent several days to weeks of sedimentation. And so although we see evidence of other sediment gravity flows, our study shows that hyperpycnal flows are the dominant source of sediment constructing the delta front and the prodelta of the studied parasequences here at Sunset Bay. So I will take any questions, but first I just want to acknowledge the village that made this possible. First and foremost, my advisor, David Mohrig, for his mentorship and his guidance. I couldn't have done it without him. My committee members, Cornell Leroux and Zoltan Sylvester. I also want to thank Tim Gouge and Marielle Nelson for helping me construct the 3D drone models that unfortunately did not make it into this presentation. The morphodynamics group, of course, this work would not be possible without the funding and support of the Jackson School of Geosciences and the Rio Mar Consortium. And I want to acknowledge the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the Oregon Islands National Wildlife Refuge because they allowed us to drone these outcrops and collect hand samples and made this study possible. So thank you so much to everybody, and thank you to you guys for listening to my talk today.
Thank you so much. Okay, now you can see me. Thank you so much, Nicole. I'm going to go ahead and clap because I think one of the most disappointing things about virtual talks is you don't hear the applause at the end. But I see some virtual applause symbols coming up. So I think everybody's doing their best to say you did a great job.
Thank you.
I do have a question I kind of want to start with, but
Sure.
in case if anybody else has a question, I would like people to go ahead, and I see some cameras turned on. If you want to ask a question, please raise your digital hand, or you can raise your physical hand. That's fine too. I think you all have the ability to unmute yourself, so if you want, you could just unmute and ask your question.
Yes, ask away. So many cool rocks.
One of the things I was going to ask was, you mentioned at the very end that, what was it, drone photography didn't make it into the talk. What exactly, do you want to maybe briefly say what would have been included if you had the ability to put that in here? I mean, obviously you can't describe a picture, but how would that have helped your study?
Yeah, no, it certainly helped our, yeah, no, it certainly helped our study. So we used drones to image these outcrops, and then we used a program called Agisoft to create a 3D drone model of these outcrops. And so the way that that's helpful is understanding how these things are laterally continuous, like how these deposits are laterally continuous. So I created actually an orthomosaic, which is kind of like a picture of the 3D model of our South Sunset Bay outcrop, which is beautiful. It's got like the best hummocks you've ever seen. And that was really helpful for me because you can just see not only how everything stacks vertically, but just the lateral continuity of these deposits. And it actually does change across the coast. And that's one of the benefits of the study areas, that we can really look at the lateral distribution of these beds. In my thesis, we do talk about those lateral relationships, and David and I are in the process of, of completing this manuscript that we hope to submit to a journal soon. And we will certainly be touching on, how these deposits change in space laterally, because it's really cool. They change a lot.
Great. So that sounds like a perfect advertisement to keep our eyes open for the paper. And then maybe think about how this fits into concepts for reservoir characterization and maybe modeling.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I sort of stole the first question, and there's probably time for at least one more question if anybody has anything additional they'd like to ask. And if not, that's okay. I often say, I might be wrong, but I often say, please feel free to contact the speaker separately if you have additional questions later, or you rewatch this recording on YouTube and you're like, oh yeah, why didn't I ask that? All right, then I would like to go ahead and transition into a discussion about fieldwork. As Nicole mentioned, this was a entirely or close to entirely field-based project, and thus was quite important for this research project in general. But I'd like to expand the discussion to discuss how field experiences are important for geoscience education in general. And just letting the audience know, that the panelists already know this, but we mean all levels of geoscience education. So not just graduate school education, but how does field experiences impact education from young children all the way up to people that are in their careers, and how does this help us as we continue to grow and develop? So our panelists today are Nicole Gonzalez, who you've already met. We are also going to be hearing from Dr. David Mohrig, who is Nicole's advisor and a professor at the Jackson School of Geosciences at UT Austin. And we are also lucky to be joined today by Dr. Rondi Martinson, who is a principal at Hydrocarbon Insight and a past AAPG president. And so I'm going to add you all to the spotlight so that you're big for everybody's. All right, so now our panelists should be the people that you can see the most on your screen. And so we're really hoping to get questions from the audience. And so please do raise your hand throughout this discussion, but especially at the end, and drop questions in the chat. But we're going to start off with a couple questions to get the conversation going. So I'd like to ask the panel. Oh, no, wait, I'm going to let the panelists introduce themselves. I forgot I didn't let you all do that yet. How about David? Let's start with you. Please introduce yourself. Tell us a bit about yourself and your experience and observations on the importance of fieldwork in education.
Okay, well, hello everyone. My name is David Mohrig. I'm a professor of geology, really sedimentology and geomorphology at the University of Texas at Austin. And I find going out in the field with students so valuable because it immerses all of us into the natural system where there is really everything available to observe and evaluate. And so that means that we have to think hard when we have certain questions that we're trying to understand. What is the kind of data that we have to collect? You know, learning what is important versus what is not important for a particular set of questions is a really powerful skill to take forward with really anything to do with the Earth system itself. And it means that learning how to extract that necessary information from a complex system is really a uniquely field-based experience. So you can't get that experience from a book, from a lecture, even from a simplified laboratory or numerical experiment. You really need to go to the place where it's all available and you make the decision about what to focus on. I'll turn it over to one of my other. How about you, Rondi?
I agree with you a lot, David. I love going in the field and I love seeing the lights turn on in students' eyes. Another thing in terms of, and I agree, the being able to define a problem in a specific problem and then knowing what data you need to collect to solve that problem is a critical skill rather than, you know, just kind of doing a machine gun approach to things. Particularly in time constraint problems that a lot of people working in industry, you can't collect all the data. It's always that data that needs to be, that you can see has some economic impact, mostly that it benefits, as opposed to just really understanding the system. So I agree with you wholeheartedly about that. Plus, you know, I no longer teach at the University of Wyoming. I taught there for nearly 40 years, and it was a great experience. I had wonderful colleagues. The department was very diverse in terms of gender, so I never had issues with that. And there was never an issue that a woman could or couldn't do anything. So that was fortunate because that isn't always the case. I retired a couple of years ago. I still consult and I still go in the field and I teach professionals to look at rocks. Matter of fact, I have a course coming up in June, taking a number of professional geoscientists around, and hopefully some engineers too. They need this to be able to look at the rocks. And I teach it with a colleague of mine, and we have a long-standing joke that's he or she who sees the most rocks wins. So, I mean, I could go on and on. I don't want to hog things, but one of the things I didn't mention earlier to you, Rebecca, was observational skills. It's so important in so many things. It's critical in geoscience. And when you're out in the field, and particularly when you're on your own, you have to make the observations. You might have a colleague or a prof point out and help some things with you, but you're really do that. It's up to you. And honing your observational skills allows you, I think, to be more observant in any, you know, in any kind of data set you're looking at, not just the rocks. The recognition of the importance of bright spots was basically based on observation. People had been looking at them for years and took someone to say, hey, you know, I noticed that. Well, those things are important. Rebecca?
Thank you. We are going to touch more on the different skills and their importance, but I'm going to give Nicole an opportunity. You already talked a bit about how important fieldwork was for your research project. Did you have anything to add just generally in your entire geoscience education?
Yeah, so, you know, I had a very unique experience of being introduced to the geosciences early on in high school. And I think through the GeoForce Texas program here at the Jackson School. And so what that program does is it exposes high schoolers to the field. And so we get to travel to a place in the United States and for a week and study geology, which is so neat. And so I think something that I would add is it's really important to gain that exposure early. You know, I think it's kind of sad that like the curriculums vary so much between states and cities and that whole thing. But it is really important to introduce geoscience, I think, at the high school level. And, you know, it's not just about, you know, going to the Rocky Mountains or something like that. I mean, you can do that, but even in places that are a little bit more secluded or whatever, like you could go to a road cut and observe the rocks there. You know, just any kind of field experience I think is really valuable, and from a young age is really useful. So yeah, so I definitely agree with the points that David and Rondi have said, but I think early exposure and then consistent exposure, right? Like I have had multiple field experiences from geoforce to my undergraduate research at the University of Colorado Boulder to, you know, my graduate studies that I just showed you.
Thank you. Yeah, I think I agree. Early exposure is super important. I know for me, it started in the Girl Scouts, just being a young little Girl Scout going out and looking at rocks and other environmental scenarios. So
I wanted to, yeah, that early exposure. One of the things I didn't realize growing up was I spent my summers in the wilds in New Jersey.
Me too. Yeah, me too. New Jersey.
Fact, well, it does have wilds. And I remember in the brooks there, I would pick up rocks, they were limestone, and crack them open, and lo and behold, there were fossils inside. Yes. So I think this, even if it's not necessarily geology, because I didn't even, I mean, kind of knew they were fossils, but being exposed to outdoor activities, you said Girl Scouts or anything, just being out in nature is beneficial.
This actually, this transitions quite smoothly into one of the main first topics we wanted to talk about, which was what are the valuable skills that students are learning in the field, and how can students take these skills and apply them in their future career? And that could include not just being successful at the career, but how can they also explain the importance of these skills when they're interviewing for jobs and applying for jobs. And so there was sort of a bunch of questions there, but people are really interested recently in understanding how to take their experiences, really focus on the valuable portion, and then communicate it in order to progress in their career. I don't know, Rondi, did you have some thoughts on this?
The skills you learn in the field, besides already mentioned, improving your observational skills, is scale. Scale is so important in all aspects. When we learn things, either whether it's in a lecture, in a classroom, or in a book, or anything, or maps or cross sections you make, the scale is not real. It's not a true scale. And the only place we can really understand a true scale is in the field and looking at rocks, looking how they behave, looking at thicknesses, how rock types change from one to another, whether they're sharp or whether they're gradational and things like that Nicole was talking about, that she observed in her field area. And in the subsurface, if we're gonna make interpretations and correlations, we need to understand the scale of the types of units that might be present in a certain depositional system. For instance, you have that beautiful, Rebecca, that beautiful, looks like a fluvial dominated delta or something behind you. It's got a lot of distributary channels anyway. Maybe they're tidal channels, I don't know. But the reservoir architecture, the sand bodies in that is going to look very different than, say, something like a wave dominated delta of the Nile. And so without understanding these complexities, we look at well logs. Something that's 100 feet is an inch on a lot of well logs. What is 100 feet on a seismic wavelet? I don't know. And what's the resolution there? But we have to be able to understand true scale and how it relates to the data sets we're looking at. And I'll say one last thing. Companies value that. When sometime, I can't remember when it was that I was at AAPG, but AAPG has a corporate advisory board called the CAB. And they were discussing the possibility of AAPG developing a field course for professionals because they were finding they're very bright, very talented young hires were making interpretations that weren't realistic. They didn't have an appreciation, all of them, for what rocks can and can't do and what they really look like. And so they thought then this field experience is almost necessary. That was kind of they were quite upset that a lot of the students they hired, now they did not hire them because they didn't have field work, but they found that that was a part of their education that was lacking.
That's very interesting, Rondi. It's unfortunate that it seems that we're lacking some of those skills. David, did you have anything to follow up on or have any additional comments?
Yeah, I'll build on what Rondi said, agreeing with everything that she said, and highlighting again this point of, going into the field, you have the whole natural system in front of you, and you get to really hone your skills on what to observe, how to observe it, what to analyze, how to analyze and synthesize that, and to solve the problem in hand, the questions that you're asking. And that's really important when thinking about the Earth system. Understanding what the necessary amount of complexity to include in your description of a system is critical for any kind of modeling or just defining of the problem that you're looking at. And that necessary complexity and getting good at saying, well, I need to include this much, actually makes students much better at approaching the topics and the techniques associated with data analytics and machine learning and using those algorithms. Instead of just blindly using them, they've developed a certain amount of intuition about what degree of complexity are they actually looking for in processing vast quantities of data using those techniques. So I think it makes students much more marketable as a result. I'll stop there.
I appreciate that. I only laugh because we don't necessarily want you to stop, but luckily this conversation will continue. I was just dropping a comment in the chat that I think that's very insightful, David, and my comment is always trying to connect it back to decreasing costs and decreasing time, but that early understanding of the complexity that's necessary for a problem severely cuts down on costs in the long run. And so I think that is a very valuable skill to have and what I've observed in my own work. Nicole, did you have anything to add, or said another way, which skills do you think you're going to be taking to your internship this summer? Sorry, I sort of threw you that curveball, but I'm fascinated.
No, that's fine. I completely agree with Rondi and David. And honestly, I mean, I can't imagine going into this internship without my master's work. I think this project has really allowed me to hone and better those skills that Rondi and David were talking about, especially those observational skills. It is intimidating when you first go out there and you're kind of like, whoa, like Rondi was saying, the scale, right? You're like, oh, okay, we're talking about kilometers, we're talking about meters of height and everything, and so of thickness. And so definitely, like they mentioned, just determining, what's important and what's not and what to focus on is definitely something I'll carry over to my internship. And just to highlight that when I was interviewing for these oil and gas companies, I was actually surprised by how excited they were about all the different field experiences that I had, because I had geoforce, obviously, but then I also, during my time at CU Boulder, I got to do an undergraduate honors thesis with Jim Metcalf, who's actually on this call right now. Hi, Jim. And he was my undergraduate research advisor, and I got to go out to Nevada and look at metamorphic core complexes there. And we did a lot of really cool field work. And so, that's an experience. I also, with CU's program, I got to go to Australia, to Southern Australia, and do field work there. I got to do hydro field work. north of Boulder, like up in the mountains. So I just think that what Rondi's saying is right. Like the more rocks you look at, the more you know about these different systems, I think the better off you are. And so, yeah, that was something that I wasn't expecting when I interviewed. They were so interested, like, tell us about your fieldwork. What did you do? What did you see? Which was cool because I love the field. And so that was nice.
Yeah, that is really exciting when you get to be interviewed by somebody who understands the importance of all of your experiences.
Right. It was like, oh, I do have like the seismic interpretation skills and I've looked at that stuff, but they were like, oh, you have all this fieldwork. Tell us about it.
Well, hopefully you continue being able to directly apply it as well as indirectly.
Yeah, for sure.
So Nicole, Nicole, you have seismic interpretation skills. So yes. How did your field work and looking at the scale of things help you be able to understand the scale of things on seismic? I mean, you have to upscale some from the field, but at the same time, I think like the example of, if you see a great big channel fill in a seismic,
right,
okay, big scoured surface, are you going to interpret that as a channel?
Well, yeah, so that's a good point.
Or a valley.
Right, that's it. That's a good point. It's all about scale, right? Yeah, no, I mean, I think David teaches a 3D seismic stratigraphy course here at UT, and that was super helpful. And we do look at these cool delta systems. We look at submarine channels, and I mean, that was like my first semester of graduate school when I hadn't really even fully grasped kind of what we were doing for the project. But looking back, now with, all of this field work and having completed this project, I feel like I could go back and do those activities a lot better, interpret that a lot better for sure.
This actually quite nicely transitions into some of the next things that we were hoping to talk about. And that was asking about current trends that you all have observed in terms of access and potentially also inclusion to field opportunities, and maybe not just field opportunities, but maybe also some of that seismic interpretation experience you're talking about and how they may or may not go hand in hand. I'd like to hear from you all and what your observations are, and maybe if you have any suggestions for people for how to increase their access to opportunities. And David, let's start with you.
Sure, thanks. Yeah, I want to discuss a couple points in this regard, and first by coming back to something that Nicole touched on in some of her opening comments about early and often access to the field. It is really important, and I see a growing a groundswell in promoting early access to field work. It doesn't make much sense to me that we wait until the latter half of one's undergraduate career to really share with them immersive field experiences. And as a result of that, a few of my colleagues and I have started teaching an introductory geology class that in the very first semester of their freshman year, we go out and we introduce the field of geology in the field. So every Friday we go out and learn together about how to read the Earth system. And that is, you can just see that come alive to all of the students, and it's a way for them to fully grasp how things are connected. That is harder to do when you're talking to them in a lecture hall or in a classroom. I think this is so important because the big questions that we have today, that society faces, whether they're land use decisions or water or energy transition decisions, all of these are really best understood and best handled by those who have been trained in looking at the Earth as a system. And looking at the environment itself really requires you to get out in the environment. So if we want to train the next generation and continue training ourselves in these things that we need to be working on so critically, we really need to get out in the field as often as possible. And that really brings me to my second point about field experiences. I think that field experiences are actually much broader than what any one of us, any of the number of us on this, on this webinar consider them to be. We have so many different styles of field experiences. Really, almost any discipline, at least in the earth sciences, could be taught and should have an element taught in the field. And there is an ever increasing range of tools and technologies that can be applied to studying in the field. And what that provides then with all the different technologies and all the different disciplines is it maximizes the potential for each student to find her or his path and develop their passion in this field. It's not just one shoe fits all anymore. We should be doing this in such a way that we can have many shoes, and that hopefully will bring us, in fact, more than hopefully, I have found that it does provide a much more inclusive environment to attract students to the earth sciences.
I can't say what Wyoming is doing. We did have kind of an earlier field course, and in our intro classes, we always went out because we had fabulous geology right around us, but not all universities get to have that. One thing I did suggest at one point was, a lot of geology majors don't come in as geology majors. So we really do need to get it out somehow about the earth before then so they can know about that. But the questions that society faces, the environment, energy, those are the big societal issues. And a lot of that, is based on looking at our earth system and seeing how it all fits together. A suggestion I had was at Wyoming was to take both incoming freshmen with majors who had designated a major in geology, as well as inviting some undeclared majors going into the honors program to participate in a summer field camp to go out and look at whatever the natural wonders are and study them in the region of that college. In Wyoming, there's all sorts of natural wonders. We could hit, in a couple of weeks, a couple of national parks and show them the beauty of the earth, as well as the mysteries of the earth, and get them on the road to discovering their passions.
I like that. And it doesn't need to include such a fantastic setting. As Rondi mentioned, you mentioned New Jersey earlier. I also grew up in New Jersey, and my high school had a campus ecology class, and there's nothing too impressive of the ecology of a random location in New Jersey, but it was enough that it got me excited and I wanted to do earth science. So I think these things are possible all over the world.
Most regions, have something of wonder that they can go and see, even if it is just a road cut, Nicole. I mean, it's to get out there and show them something,
Sure. Or even if it's not a road cut, I've met plenty of people who became geologists in Florida that didn't even have those. They just had, they have beaches. Or if you're in Miami, I believe there's a couple meter, exposure of carbonates there. Nicole, did you have anything to add on this topic?
No, I agree with everything that's been said. I think near to my heart is also just that push to that early exposure, bringing it, pipeline programs like Geoforce, and not just Geoforce, but I mean, myself, I'm a UT Geoscience ambassador, and part of that is, I'm a connector, if you will. Like, I like to go out into my community and talk about like what I do as a geoscientist, and I've worked with the Boys and Girls Clubs of Greater Houston for many years, and that's something that I do with them. Like, I go and just talk about earth science, and again, that might not be directly field based, but even now there's so many cool like interactive field like programs, and so just putting that on the screen and having them look at it and bringing some rock samples and fossils and things that they can look at is really exciting. You know, they're kind of like, you study rocks, and then I tell them, yeah, you know, there's more than that, but yes, okay, let's start there. And then by the end of the, you know, the workshop, I'm going to be a geoscientist. You know, they're excited about just the natural world. And so yeah, I think that early exposure is really important. I mean, I wouldn't be here without that early exposure. So that's why it's so near and dear to me.
I'm going to take that as a good opportunity for everybody who's watching this currently or watching this recording in the future. These themes that we're talking about are really tying quite heavily into some past webinars we've held and that are on our YouTube channel. So Nicole, you were just talking about, I don't think you used the word digital, but you were talking about access to, maybe it was digital material. And we had a great webinar last November on digital geology and how to educate through it. We also had a webinar in October on how academia is responding to an evolving geoscience world and evolving needs. And we touched a lot on early exposure and education. So I'm just making this observation that it seems like every event we hold is just kind of coming back to the need for exposure to geology at all across ages and all across people. And so we do have those other resources on our YouTube channel, so I encourage everyone to check them out. We are at the end of our time, and so rather than asking another question, and which I'm sure we'd want to talk about forever, I'm going to wrap this up. I think we've touched on a lot of really great themes, and we've addressed topics that we've heard from previous webinars, as well as what we've heard from our membership throughout time. And I really appreciate all the speakers coming here today and sharing their thoughts and views. Once again, I always encourage people to reach out to our speakers. I probably should ask the speakers in advance if they're okay with me suggesting that, but I'm going to go ahead and suggest it because all of these speakers are very friendly and happy to discuss further. So reach out if you have additional thoughts or you want additional advice, or if there were any resources you heard them mention and you can't find. Also, please be on the lookout for future AAPG Women's Network events. We have a lot going on at Image in Houston. So please be on the lookout for that. We are also in the process of planning the Geology of Coffee, an educational and networking experience, and that will be fully digital. And that's in response to the successes we've had from the Geology of Beer and the Geology of Wine and Cheese. So check out those online and keep your eyes open also for upcoming technical events. And with that, I'm going to say thank you for coming today, and I look forward to seeing everybody again soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thanks to everybody dropping comments in the chat. I think
go see the rocks.
Yeah, go see the rocks.
Rock
and,
on.
If you're watching the recording of this later, I don't think you can see the chat, so I'm just going to briefly mention that we're getting a lot of good feedback in the chat right now, saying that there's a great discussion and presentation. Someone mentioned, I have a feeling you're preaching to the choir on the importance of fieldwork. And I think, Michelle, I think you might be true, or you might be correct on that.